Everyone, it's Delaney James again. And for this presentation, I chose cortisol and aldosterone hormones for this week's endocrinology topic. This is for Bio 515 at Grand Canyon University. Hopefully, by the end of this presentation, you will have a foundation on what cortisol and aldosterone is, how these hormones work together, and what happens if the body overproduces or underproduces these hormones. And then we're also going to look at aldosterone's connection to heart disease, in particular, and cortisol's role in metabolism. So, cortisol is a primary glucocorticoid hormone and is released in the adrenal glands, and it plays an important part in carbohydrate, protein, and fat metabolism. It also executes significant permissive actions for other hormonal activities and helps people resist stress. Glucocorticoids, like cortisol, are a steroid hormone. These hormones will suppress inflammation in tissues, control metabolism in muscles, fat, the liver, and bones as well. Cortisol is also good at regulating your body's stress response because cortisol can be released after adrenaline is released in our body's fight or flight response. And cortisol triggers the release of glucose from the liver for fast energy during these times of stress. Cortisol is regulated via the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. If cortisol levels are low, the hypothalamus will release corticotropin releasing hormone, which tells the pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which then stimulates the adrenal glands to produce and release cortisol. This picture right here is the organic chemistry structure for cortisol. And you can tell when we get to aldosterone that they're kind of similar in structure and they kind of behave similarly as well. So, cortisol and metabolism. Excuse me. Cortisol stimulates gluconeogenesis, which is basically a process of converting amino acids into carbohydrates. If there are no new nutrients being absorbed in the body, glycogen in our liver is going to become depleted, and it's going to be released as glucose into the blood because our glycogen is stored, and if there's no new nutrients, that's what our body's going to start to feed off of. This process of gluconeogenesis is going to help replenish liver glycogen storage. So it ultimately helps maintain normal blood glucose levels between meals and in times when nutrients are lacking. This is very important because the brain can only use glucose as a metabolic fuel, but our nervous tissue cannot store glycogen at all. So glucose concentration in the blood must be maintained to an appropriate level in order to supply glucose to our brain. Without cortisol, the liver glycogens would be depleted, glucose levels would drop, and there will not be metabolic fuel for our brains. Not only does it trigger the production of new carbohydrates, but cortisol also inhibits glucose uptake and use by many other tissues except in our brain, which is going to allow glucose to be used primarily by the brain, and all of our other tissues can use different types of metabolic fuel. Cortisol will also stimulate the degradation in many tissues. This is going to break down proteins into their building blocks, which is the amino acid. And so our amino acid concentration in the blood is going to increase. We now have these free-flowing amino acids that are then available for gluconeogenesis that is going to start to replenish our liver glycogen storage. Lastly, cortisol is going to facilitate lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat stores in our adipose tissue. So it's going to be releasing free fatty acids into the blood. These fatty acids become an alternative metabolic fuel instead of glucose, which is helpful because, once again, our brain needs glucose. However, other tissues in our body can use fatty acids for use, saving glucose for the brain. So here's that picture of aldosterone that I was telling you about. You can tell it's kind of a similar structure as cortisol. Excuse me. So what is aldosterone? Aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid. I'm really bad at pronouncing these words. It is a mineralocorticoid hormone produced in the adrenal cortex that has an effect on water and salt regulation in our bodies. Aldosterone works on the distal tubule and the collecting duct of the nephrons, which is going to allow water and sodium to absorb and release, and potassium is going to release as well. And all this is going to influence our blood pressure based on water decreasing or increasing based on sodium concentration, kind of the basis of osmosis. This absorbed water contributes to the volume of extracellular fluid, which is going to affect the blood pressure. When blood pressure or serum sodium is low, it's going to trigger the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. This is basically a system that is like a waterfall effect of hormones for aldosterone being produced. Excuse me. So renin is going to be secreted from our renal cells. Then angiotensinogen is going to split into angiotensin 1. ACE, which is an enzyme from the lungs, is going to convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, which is going to stimulate the production of aldosterone. So we get this waterfall effect of something being secreted from the renal cells. Then we get a hormone that's going to split into two. And then once that's split, it stimulates the production of aldosterone. So when I was doing my research, I actually found a review that tries to link aldosterone to heart disease. Please excuse my dog in the background whining. So cardiovascular disease is one of the leading causes of death in the United States. One individual study determined that 9 potentially modifiable risk factors were accounting for 90% of the risk for cardiovascular disease. One of these risk factors was psychosocial distress, especially chronic stress. So, cortisol is considered a mediator hormone that has an indirect relationship between psychological stress and cardiovascular disease. There's pretty much literature out there on that already. However, Kubzansky and Alder wanted to review if aldosterone is a potential mediary relationship between stress and cardiovascular disease. So this review looked at the known function and role of aldosterone in the body, and then it studied its role in the brain and the peripheral nervous system as well. They looked at literature on aldosterone and cardiovascular disease and links between aldosterone and chronic negative effects. And basically, it came down to this idea that activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and the renin angiotensin system increases aldosterone. Therefore, psychological stress activates both the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and the adrenomedullary system. So, aldosterone may be released in response to stress and provides an additional pathway between negative affective states and cardiovascular health. Some consequences include high blood pressure and evidence of myocardial necrosis and fibrosis. So, what are impacts of high and low cortisol levels? So, high levels of cortisol for an extended period of time is considered Cushing syndrome, which could be caused by large amounts of corticosteroid medications, tumors in the pituitary gland that produce adrenocorticotropic hormone, and adrenal gland tumors or excessive growth of adrenal tissue, which is going to cause excess production of cortisol. This increased cortisol comes with weight gain, muscle weakness, especially in the upper arms and the thighs, high blood pressure and high blood sugar, excessive hair growth, and weak bones. On the opposite end, low levels of cortisol is considered adrenal insufficiency caused by either an autoimmune reaction or underactive pituitary gland. These low cortisol levels produce the following symptoms: fatigue, weight loss, poor appetite, and low blood pressure. So, on the left side of the screen, this right here is kind of a overview of the Cushing syndrome symptoms. They tend to have rounder face, larger shoulders, um, thin legs, and characterized by these purple pink stretch marks on the stomach. Over here, we see the low cortisol symptoms. Whoa, that was weird. We see the low cortisol symptoms, low energy, low blood pressure, constantly being sick due to your immune system, overworking, brain fog, and poor stress tolerance, because cortisol is a stress hormone. And it also provides you some solution. So, getting some sunlight, more salt, adequate protein, things like that. So, lastly, impacts of aldosterone, high and low levels. So, higher than normal aldosterone levels is usually called primary aldosteronism or Cohen's syndrome. This is usually caused by a non cancerous tumor on the adrenal gland, which is going to cause the adrenal gland to overproduce aldosterone. And so, given that aldosterone plays a role in ion concentration, hyperaldosteronism is going to cause an increase in sodium levels and a decrease in potassium levels, leading to symptoms such as high blood pressure, headaches, muscle weakness, and extreme thirst. Opposite of that, we have low levels of aldosterone. And some causes of this include Addison's disease, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and diabetes and kidney disease could also cause low levels of aldosterone. This kind of has a complete opposite effect. So we see a decrease in sodium and an increase in potassium with symptoms like low blood pressure, muscle weakness, nausea, and irregular heartbeat. So on the left over here, we see the Cone syndrome symptoms. Heart attack and heart arrhythmia tend to be more associated with Cohen syndrome. In Addison's disease, we start to see hair loss, abdominal pain, decreased appetite, and depression as well, which I thought was interesting, linking a mental health issue with an endocrinology issue. But in most of my research, depression tend to come up with low aldosterone levels. So these are my sources for my presentation. I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that you learned something. I'm sorry if you heard my dog moving around in the background. I apologize. Have a blessed and wonderful day.